So today it's a pleasure to welcome Dave Bookless. He's no stranger to many of us to come to talk to us. Dave is Director of Theology at A Rocha International, and many of us will know the tragic events that happened just about a month ago at A Rocha, and we're especially grateful for Dave still to coming for us, and we will continue to uphold them and their leaders in our prayers.
Okay.
For those who don't know, A Rocha is an international Christian organization which is engaged in scientific research, environmental education, and community-based conservation projects. A few words about Dave himself. His first degree was in modern history, where he was at Jesus College here in Cambridge, and he stayed for a PGCE specializing in multi-faith religious education before becoming a lecturer at Bradford's Interfaith Education Centre. He subsequently trained for ordination, but then left parish ministry to go and set up A Rocha UK and was their national director until 2008. And he's now their director of theology. He's since completed a PhD in biblical theology and biodiversity conservation. And despite the name Bookless, has written several books and articles. And alongside that multi-talented background, he's also part-time vicar of a multiracial church in St Mary's, Norwood. His title today is From Ecosystem Services to Extinction Rebellion, Why and How We Should Value Wildlife. Will you join me in welcoming Dave Bookless?
Thank you, Keith. It's very, very good to be with you here. It's nice to be back in the garden room, where I've been at various Faraday events in the past, and it's lovely to be able to share with you. Because time is pressing, I'm going to dive straight into our subject and talk about that for the rest of the time that we have. And just, in a sense, to explain my interest in this, some years ago I was asked to write a paper for the Jubilee Centre here in Cambridge, one of their Cambridge papers, on the Bible and biodiversity, with the title, Let Everything That Has Breath Praise the Lord. And some of the ideas that others helped me with, and we, because these Jubilee, these Cambridge papers are not just a solo effort, you're very much a team of people that produce them. Some of the ideas from that have filtered into what I'll be sharing today. And then, as has just been mentioned, I've recently completed my doctorate through the Divinity Faculty here in Cambridge. And the title, Why Should Wild Nature Be Preserved? A Dialogue Between Biblical Theology and Biodiversity Conservation. And the Faraday Institute very generously supported me in helping fund my fees for that, and I've got a copy to give to the Faraday Library, and hopefully it'll eventually turn into a book as well, although probably rewritten a bit more accessibly than Cambridge PhDs require. So that's enough of background. Let's just set the context for this a little bit. Every few years, the WWF bring out something called the Living Planet Report, looking at the current state of play in terms of biodiversity and human impacts on nature globally. And their last report came out in 2018. The headline in the newspapers said, humanity has wiped out 60% of animal populations since 1970. And just digging below that, here's a graph looking at wildlife populations globally from 1970. This isn't 60% of species going extinct, this is populations. So in most cases, we haven't seen dramatic increases yet in extinctions, but we've seen a huge drop in the size of populations. Here in the UK, whether it's things like tree sparrows and turtle doves, but all over the world, we've seen that decline. And what was stated in the summary of that WWF report was this: we are the first generation that has a clear picture of the value of nature and our impact on it. We may be the last generation that can take action to reverse this trend. From now until 2020 will be a decisive moment in history. Well, we're nearly in 2020. This was the beginning of last year, this was said, and we haven't yet seen the decisive action that is needed to protect the world's biodiversity. The projection is that the decline could have reached 2/3 by the time 2020 figures have been analysed. And if we look across the different taxa at how this decline is working out, it's quite uneven. This is not global populations, this is species at risk of extinction. And you'll see that amphibians and reptiles are actually the most threatened, largely because they're very sensitive to even quite small changes in temperature and in the ecosystems that they live in. Other species like birds actually do much better because they're relatively mobile and they're able to move and respond to changes in climate and changes in the environment. Reef corals, you'll see there, 1/3 threatened with extinction, and so on. In terms of actual extinction rates, we have seen a massive increase. There is, of course, a long-term rate of extinction that has always been there, and that's the dotted line right at the bottom of the screen. But these other lines, again, following different taxa, birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fishes, and vertebrates, look at the increase in the rates of extinction really since the Middle Ages and then the Industrial Revolution. And that's when you see the huge rise in extinctions, the Industrial Revolution and human population growth. If we look at what has caused those extinctions or is threatening them, what's causing biodiversity loss, 5 major factors, according to scientists. Habitat loss and destruction, and that's the biggest of all. Over-exploitation of wildlife, and it's significant that the picture there is a trawler because it's fishing that is the biggest way in which we're over-exploiting wildlife globally. Pollution, invasive species and diseases. Here in the UK, things like ash dieback and oak processionary moth disease. Climate change, of course, as well. And this graph simply looks at those different factors. So the sort of brownish red there is habitat degradation, and you'll see for most taxa that is the biggest factor. And then exploitation, you'll see for fish, that's by far the biggest, that's the yellow. And climate change, that receives all our headlines at the moment, is comparatively minor in its impact on threats to biodiversity at this point. But that will change. That will become a bigger factor as climate change gets more and more serious. Habitat loss, habitat change is the biggest threat to biodiversity, and deforestation, particularly in our tropical forests, which are the biggest reservoirs of land-based biodiversity, is one of the biggest issues. And you'll see there that 2016, 2017 were particularly bad years, partially due to major wildfires. And this year, we don't have the figures in, of course, for this year, but this year we've heard of huge problems in the Amazon and in parts of Africa and in parts of Southeast Asia in terms of forest fires and deforestation. And many of these forest fires started deliberately. Some are caused by climate change, but many are started deliberately by people wanting to clear forest in order either to ranch cattle or to plant soy or palm oil for human consumption and for feeding animals as well. This is tree cover loss in Indonesia and parts of Malaysia just between 2001 and 2018. I don't know if you saw the headline, I don't know how many of you read the Daily Mail, but I don't know if you saw the headline a little while ago. Where have all our bugs gone? The flying insects the planet depends on plummet by 3/4, sparking fears of ecological Armageddon. Nothing like over-egging the headline, is there? But it's actually based on an important study that was done, a long-term study in German nature reserves, looking at the biomass of flying insects from 1989 through to 2013, and seeing a massive decline of something like 75%. And there's the not very scientific, but actually quite useful acid test of this. Those of you who are old enough to remember driving a car in the 1970s in summer and all the time having to clear all those squashed insects off the windscreen, well, we had some pretty hot weeks this summer. Did you have to do the same? And, you know, universally, the answer is no. And of course that's anecdotal rather than properly scientific, but it is an indication of what we're seeing here in the UK as well as in many other countries. And of course insects are often the foundation of a healthy ecosystem. And then we've got what we're doing, very well publicised in recent years, what we're doing in terms of plastic waste going into the oceans and the impact that has. And underlying all of this is humanity's impact on the planet. You may just be able to see it, there's a line going across near the middle of the screen, light green, which is world biocapacity. In other words, what we take from the planet being able to replenish. That's basically what biocapacity is. And since about 1970, as human beings, we have exceeded the world's biocapacity. We are now doing so by a very large amount. And the biggest thing there is carbon, our use of fossil fuels. The other one that's grown quite a lot in that time is cropland. We're farming far more areas. Now the scientists are going to hate this because this is just a whole bunch of graphs coming up very, very quickly, one after the other. But the non-scientists might actually like it. And all I want to do here is give you an impression of the shape of the graphs. We're looking here at world population, carbon dioxide emissions, fertilizer consumption, freshwater use, tropical forest loss, marine fish capture, and growth in transportation since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And you can see that the shape of all those graphs is an almost exponential curve as our impact has grown so enormously. The only one that bucks the trend, a couple of them we don't have data going very far back, which is why they start halfway along. But you'll see marine fish capture bucks the trend and then it goes right up and then starts coming down. It's not because we're fishing less, it's because there's less to catch. And fish populations are crashing in many parts of the world. So let's move on now to the meat of this talk and answer this question about why should humans value nature. And it's a really live debate within the global conservation community. And one of the leading thinkers in that debate is Professor Georgina Mace from University College London. And she wrote a very helpful summary paper for Science back in 2014, where she gives 4 major reasons through history why humans have protected nature. The first one is nature for itself, intrinsic value. It just is important. The second one, nature despite people. I'll come back to these in a bit more detail. The third one, nature for people. We need to look after it because it looks after us. And the fourth one, people and nature. And what I want to do for the rest of this talk is look at these in a bit more detail and then look at a biblical understanding of our relationship with nature and see how that fits in with these 4 different views. So nature for itself. Most people who go into wildlife conservation, most people who study biology, most people who get into botany or ornithology do not do so because of the economic value of nature. Most people do so because they love wildlife. They love nature. And there is just an assumption, there's a deep-seated belief across the world and across many cultures that it's important, that it matters, that we should care for it. As this quote from Jules-Henri Poincaré said, "The scientist does not study nature because it is useful, he studies it because he delights in it, and he delights in it because it is beautiful." Apologies for the sexist language, but the point is made. And one could argue that this is a fundamentally ecocentric view, that nature has value totally independently of its value to us as human beings, that we're part of nature and therefore we matter too, but that every aspect of nature matters and we should care for it. And traditionally Christians have been a bit suspicious of that view and seen it as in danger of getting close to worshipping Mother Earth instead of Father God, seen it as in danger of signing up maybe to a more esoteric or Eastern or New Age worldview. But actually there are passages in the Bible, particularly in the Old Testament, which come very close to that ecocentric view, particularly places like Psalm 104 and the book of Job. And in the book of Job we read these words where God teases Job about his idea that the world matters because of him and other human beings. And God says, "Were you there when I laid the earth's foundations?" And much later in the same passage, "Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm to water a land where no man lives, a desert with no one in it, to satisfy a desolate wasteland and make it sprout with grass?" And what God is getting at there is the fact that there are species, there are places, there are ecosystems that are apparently completely irrelevant to human well-being, and yet God seems to care about them. Their value is in no way related to their usefulness to human beings. And as I say, you can read Psalm 104 and you get a very, very similar impression from that. And to use a case study, Russia UK has a project not very far from here on the Essex-Suffolk borders called Fox Earth. And the reason for that project there is dragonflies. Yes, people get to enjoy it too, and to enjoy the dragonflies, but the primary reason is to be a place where dragonflies can be conserved and looked after, to provide good habit for them, to enable those different species of damselfly and dragonfly to thrive. That's the reason that reserve exists. And of course it's the reason many nature reserves exist as well. Not specifically dragonflies, but nature for itself. Second category, nature despite people. Does anyone know where this photo was taken? I didn't take it. No, it's not in the UK. Not in Lebanon. No. Further east. Okay, we could be here a long time. It's actually the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea. Now there is an area where humans have been excluded for entirely political reasons for 60 years. And it has become probably the most important nature reserve on the Korean peninsula. All kinds of species, plants, animals, are thriving there simply because humans tend to keep away unless they're North Korean refugees making a run for it. But it has become a very, very important place simply by keeping humans out. And if you like, it gives a good basis for this argument that the best way to look after nature is not for us to steward it, but for us to keep away from it and let it get on with its own business of being fertile and multiplying and everything else. And there is a strongly argued theory amongst some conservationists today, most famously Edward Wilson, E.O. Wilson, arguing that the best way to preserve biodiversity today is basically to fence off half the world, and so that's for other species. And we as humans, well, we can get on with destroying the bits that we've already destroyed and want to exploit. But the only way we're really going to protect nature is if we effectively take the American National Park system and multiply that so half the earth and oceans simply are there for biodiversity and they're no-go areas for human use and exploitation. And if we go to visit them, we do so simply on the visit. You leave only footprints, you take nothing away. Keeping humans out is the only way to protect nature. And so this is being discussed amongst conservationists at quite a serious level. And certainly somebody like Edward Wilson, who's a double Nobel Peace Prize winner? No, double Nobel winner, I think. He's certainly an extremely eminent conservationist, is arguing that that is the only way that we're really going to protect the nature. And to give you a case study where maybe there's a strong case for this, one of the biggest projects that Russia is involved with at the moment, one of the biggest issues, is a place called the Atewa Forest in Ghana. And Edward Wilson in his book actually identifies this as one of the 20 most important places in the world that need protecting. It's not even yet a national nature reserve in Ghana, but it's a massively important place for biodiversity, 70 critically endangered species, the richest forest for butterflies in West Africa, 1,000 plant species, 230 bird species, 50 plus mammal species, and they're discovering more all the time. And Arosh has done a lot of careful scientific work to assess the importance of Atewa for biodiversity. But there is a problem. The forests of Atewa are on hills that are largely comprised of bauxite, the raw material for aluminium. And now Chinese business is offering billions of dollars to the Ghanaian government to destroy the forest and exploit the aluminium. So you get a choice then between relatively short-term economic benefit, probably very little of it going to local people, and the long-term incalculable value of the biodiversity that is there. And then there's a third factor, how this will affect the human populations that live there as well. And largely because of Arosh's work, we now know that the rivers that start in that forest and flow outwards towards Accra and Kumasi are the main source of drinking water for 5 million people. So this discussion about Atewa is one of the biggest political issues in Ghana today. I actually told this story when I was preaching in a church in Basel on Sunday, and I noticed a couple in the congregation who were grinning broadly as I told the story. It turned out the husband was Ghanaian and the wife was Chinese. And they know about this because they've been to visit Ghana recently. This is a huge issue. So much so that Leonardo DiCaprio even tweeted about it the other week. And suddenly the number of people who are talking about it has grown exponentially because Leonardo DiCaprio is extremely famous. Very live issue. So should we care for Atewa? Should we simply say that needs protecting whatever the human interests in it are? Is nature, despite people, the only way to protect important places like that? And then the third way of looking at our relationship with nature, nature for people, or anthropocentrism. And this is a kind of conventional model of that. You'll notice there is a hierarchy within the human species in this particular pyramid, as well as the hierarchy within nature. That's often how these hierarchies pan out. And it's basically saying, if you want to put it theologically, God made it all for us. If you want to put it scientifically, it's saying we are the most evolved species, and evolution anyway surely is about the fittest surviving. And so if we can make it work for us, then surely that is what we should do in an evolutionary way. And so many of the ways that have become part of our everyday speech actually assume that nature is there for us, assume an anthropocentric basis. The very term natural resources suggests that nature is simply there to resource us, that these are things for us to use economically, culturally, and so on. And of course we need nature, we need carbon storage and improved water quality and flood defences and fuel and fresh air and all these other things. And so since the turn of the millennium, the science of ecosystem services has grown enormously, looking at what the earth produces for human benefit and trying to measure and quantify that and the threats to that. It's provisioning services, things like fresh water, raw materials, food and medicine. It's regulating services, air quality, climate, water, soil, preventing erosion, and so much more. It's supporting services, nutrient cycling, photosynthesis, soil formation, and it's cultural services. And that's where, if you like, any religious views would get smuggled in, spiritual and religious values, aesthetic values, the psychological benefit of nature, the proven fact that the further people live from an area of green space in cities, the more likely they are to have mental health problems at some point in their lifetime. That fits within the cultural values. And we can now quantify and to some extent measure in financial terms the benefit of healthy ecosystems. We can put a price on nature, at least to some extent. So there's a forest with a barcode. And the European Union has had a program called the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, TEEB, which again tries to make the economic case, and that actually it's far cheaper to protect nature now than to deal with the fallout if we have to pick up the mess later on. There's a strong economic argument. Here within the UK, the government has launched its Natural Capital Initiative, and in many Western countries now, governments talk in terms of natural capital, what nature does for us as human beings. And even I would argue what we've seen in this last year to 18 months of the massive rise of environmental activism, particularly amongst, but not only amongst the young, with Greta Thunberg and the school strikes, with Extinction Rebellion, many of these movements are actually saying it's our future. This matters for us, for future generations of human beings. Now, many who are involved in this would also say, and other species matter too, but there is a strongly anthropocentric streak to some of the arguments that are coming forward as part of these new environmental movements. And this idea that nature's there for people goes back a long way. In many ways you can trace it back to, if not beyond, Aristotle, and the idea of the great chain of being, with spiritual entities, God, angels, demons, at the top of the hierarchy, then human beings, again notice the gender hierarchy, then animals, plants and minerals. It's a very hierarchical view of nature, and ultimately in terms of our use, it's an anthropocentric one. And there have been many theologians through history who have quite blatantly taken that view. So back in the 3rd century, Origen talked about how everything has been made to serve the rational being and the rational being and his natural intelligence. And I won't read the whole quote, but I love this bit at the end, where he tries to work out why God created animals that are dangerous for us. And he says, similarly, the species of lions and bears, leopards and boars and animals of this sort are said to have been given to us in order to exercise the seeds of courage in us. It's a slightly desperate argument, I think, but it's an attempt to say that every part of nature must be there for us. It has no independent value. And John Calvin, at the time of the Reformation, said something similar. The end for which all things were created was that none of the convenience and necessities of life might be wanting to men. So there is a strong Christian tradition of anthropocentric thinking with regards to nature, that God made it for us. But there is, I would argue, an even more pervasive argument that has come from Enlightenment rationalism, which at the time, of course, arose within a Christian worldview. So you can look at Descartes, you can look at Francis Bacon, and see the idea that humans are purely rational, I think therefore I am, where animals were believed by Descartes to be entirely automata, to be basically machines without minds and without feelings. And therefore animal experimentation was fine because animals didn't have feelings. Francis Bacon argued that nature is an object to be conquered or controlled. He had a very dualist view that God and spiritual things were what the church and priests looked after, but that scientists were the priests of nature, and that God has delegated everything to do with the material world for us to do with as we wish. Science is our only way of knowing the world, and all human problems can be solved by technology. That view you find going back to Christian humanists like Francis Bacon. And today you find some Christians, and this perhaps predictably is from the United States, but some who argue that nature is only there for us. The author of this book, theologian in the States, is part of the shooting and hunting lobby there, and he argues humans were divinely placed in a position superior to animals in power and or ontology, and bestowed the privilege to utilize animals to fulfill human needs and desires. So anything we wish to use them for, we can, is what Van Tassel would argue. And you could say that this is what has been defined as anthropomonism, which is that the only environment that counts is that of the divine-human relationship, and therefore nature is just entirely for us. Let's look at the fourth view briefly before I race on to some of the biblical material. People and nature is a view that is about interdependence, recognizing we're part of nature, but not setting us up as superior to the rest of nature. You can have a slightly anthropocentric view of people and nature, and Oxfam's, what's become quite famous, their donut model here, kind of reflects that. You can see why it's called the donut model. It talks about a social foundation. Basically, the idea is that all human beings need to be within the green donut. That if you fall below that because you don't have adequate food, water, income, healthcare, energy, etc., then you are not properly looked after as a human being, but that there is an environmental ceiling around the outside that we must not transgress. And our Western societies have done that in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, energy, phosphorus and nitrogen. So it's basically saying we need to keep it all within the circle if we're going to have sustainable development. But it's still a fairly human-centered model. So what does the Bible have to say to this? In my thesis, I looked through actually only 4 of these 5 themes that I've put down here. These are God's great initiatives in the Christian scriptures, the times where God intervenes, first by creating, second, after sin and the fall, by bringing in a covenant, third, in Christ, fourth, by sending the Holy Spirit and baptizing the church. That's the one I leave out in the thesis because it gets smuggled into the last chapter, which is, if you like, the kingdom of God, the new creation, which theologically actually begins on Easter Sunday when Jesus rises from the dead. So church and consummation are 1 chapter in my thesis, but if it gets turned into a book, there'll probably be 2. So very quickly, from creation, we find that God does not make the earth only for us. God actually makes it for God's self. Creation is made in order that the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit can enjoy what they have made. Every day of creation, almost every day of creation in Genesis 1, God says, it is good, it is good, it is good. And at the end, it is all very good. Biodiversity is very good. The crown of creation is not human beings. That's not a biblical idea. It's actually the Sabbath. God's enjoyment of all that God has made is the crown of creation. And human beings are called to be guardians of God's good earth. We are described as made uniquely in God's image, not that so we can lord it over nature, but so we can reflect God's character towards the rest of nature. The image of God is a job description. We are called to reflect God's character. The God who has made it and says it is very good, then says, I give you dominion, which does not mean domination. It means servant kingship in terms of a biblical understanding of leadership. The second great theme, the theme of covenant. And the first explicit covenant in the Bible is, of course, the covenant with Noah. And the covenant with Noah is not just a covenant with Noah, nor just a covenant with his descendants. It's also a covenant with every living creature on the earth, repeated again and again and again in the Hebrew of Genesis 9. Even in one verse, my covenant with the earth. So this initiative of God in creating a relationship, a mutual relationship with what he's created, that's what covenant's about, is not just a human covenant. It's a covenant that includes biodiversity, that includes ecosystems, that includes the whole earth. And that has huge and important implications for how we think about God's purposes for all of these. And then we move to the third great intervention, where God becomes part of creation in the incarnation. And the radical theological statement that that is within a Hebraic worldview cannot be overstated. That the creator of matter becomes material. And it's significant that John's Gospel and other parts of the New Testament do not say God became man, because the Greek word for man is anthropos. They say God became flesh. The Greek word is sarx. And that's always the word used for the incarnation. And it's a bigger word. It includes human flesh, but it includes animal flesh too. It's the same Greek word as meat. God became a creature in the incarnation. Of course, he had to become a human being because sin came through human beings and redemption had to. But there is an identification with the created order in the incarnation. And then in the work of Christ on the cross and in his resurrection, we find that the whole of creation is included too. We have, as Christians, tended to cut down the gospel, to make it simply a spiritual relationship or a human relationship with God. But Colossians is absolutely clear that when Christ died on the cross, all things in heaven and on earth are reconciled to God. And Romans 8 is absolutely clear that the whole of creation is waiting to be set free because of what Christ has done on the cross. All the broken relationships are restored through the death and resurrection of Christ. And then the church. And I'm just using this verse from Romans 8 here. Creation waits in eager expectation for who? The children of God. Who are the children of God? The church. To be revealed. Creation is waiting for the church. It's an astonishingly bold statement that St. Paul is making there. And I believe, and Tom Wright in his writing on this, N.T. Wright would agree with this, that this actually is linking back to Genesis 1, to the first command that we are given to reflect God's image in how we look after the rest of nature, and our failure to do that. And now here, the church in the power of the Spirit is recharged with that. Creation is waiting for the church. And finally today we're seeing the church waking up and beginning to take this on. More than 2,000 churches in England and Wales have become eco-churches in the last 3 years. Finally, the church is waking up to this. And then the final act that will come to its culmination when Christ returns. An act that involves judgment, discontinuity, but also redemption, continuity. And all the eschatological pictures in the scriptures are best understood when you recognize they have both those elements: judgment, discontinuity, and redemption, continuity. And one can look at Romans 21, Revelation 21, Romans 8, and numerous other passages that bring out these joint themes. One of the things I often like to mention is it's very significant that the Greek word for new heaven, new earth, new creation is not the word neos. That's never used in the New Testament for those. And neos means brand new. It's the word kainos, which is a much more subtle word and has connotations of restoration, of repair, of redemption, perhaps even of recycling. And I think that's really important for us to think about. So what we see here is God's purposes for all creation are reflected in all of God's major initiatives in the Bible. If we look then at Georgina Mace's fourfold division of how humans through history have cared for nature, I think it's that fourth one, people and nature, that perhaps comes closest to that biblical vision, and I argue that in a lot more detail in the thesis. And rather than an human-centered and anthropocentric or an ecocentric view of nature, we should, as Christians, have a theocentric. Recognize that it's made for God. God so loved the cosmos, to use John 3:16. And human beings are there not because we're the least important at the bottom of the heart, but because we are, to use an ecological term, a keystone species, one that God has placed in a particularly important role with regards to the rest of nature. It is our vocation to care for creation. So rather than Georgina Mace's term people and nature, I much prefer the term people within nature, which is a far more ecological term anyway. People and suggests that we're kind of two separate categories. We are part of nature, but we also have a particular role and vocation within it. So very finally, I'm just going to list these as I finish. Some attitudes, some values and virtues that this worldview should lead to. It should be a worldview that sees us as interdependent with nature, that refuses to see the rest of nature simply as natural resources or natural capital or ecosystem services, but sees it in a very sense as given value because God gives it value, not because we value it. It matters because it matters to God. And that means that we should have perhaps something like this. And again, I borrowed this from Oxfam, but it seems to me to reflect quite well a biblical understanding of the relationship between nature, human society, and the economy. It's very significant that the word oikos in Greek for home is the root word for ecology and economy, I think. They're both about how we look after our home. If we think of the general election and how all of our political parties seem to be setting things up, it seems that the economy is the most important thing, and we are there to serve the economy, and economic growth is what matters above everything else, and people can be sacrificed on the altar of the economy. That's a complete reversal of how it should be. The economy should be there to serve human society. But if the economic domain is a subset of human society is a subset of the ecological domain. That's a biblical vision. And somehow we have to turn that into a political reality. And that's the challenge we all face. If we're to do it, we need to rediscover a sense of wonder, a delight in nature. This is a picture of a kingfisher caught at a Russia's site in Portugal, being held by somebody who found it a really profound, almost a numinous experience, to have the beating heart of that kingfisher on his palm, to see its amazing colours, and then to turn it over so that it could happily then fly away. All children have that sense of wonder naturally. Many of us as adults have had it squeezed out of us, and we need to rediscover it. Simply by simple things, going for walks, watching trees, meditating on snowdrops, paddling our feet in the sea or the river. Very simple things that reconnect us with that sense of wonder. And then wisdom, recognizing that science is vitally important, but science is not exactly the same as wisdom. The medieval thinkers had these two terms, scientia, science, sapientia, wisdom. And we need both together. The Psalms tell us, in wisdom you made them all, the earth is filled with all of your creatures. There are ethical, philosophical, and religious questions that science on its own cannot answer. It's a vital tool in answering those, but we need to hold together science and wisdom. And then our work, recognizing that caring for nature is the first, most basic and fundamental human calling. It's the first great commission, the first great commandment in the Bible, is to do with our relationship with our fellow creatures. And it's one that is given universally to all human beings. So as Christians, we aren't the only ones called to do this. Our atheist, humanist, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist neighbours are called to do it just as much. And we need to find common ground with them in how we care for this world and find common language. Do ask me more about Russia. I've run out of time, so I'm not going to say more about it now, but I'm happy to answer questions on that, and there are other people here who are as well. I'm going to finish with this slide. A lovely verse, or two verses from Psalm 145. The Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and rich in love. The Lord is good to all. He has compassion on all he has made. All your works praise you, Lord. Your faithful people extol you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got plenty of time for questions. I can see some hands coming up. I'll take the lady down the front first.
Thank you. Thank you firstly for an excellent lecture. And I say that because I've written more or less the same thing. But my book, as an Eastern Orthodox theologian, centres on the Eastern Orthodox and the very early church texts. But I'm so grateful that you're doing the same thing, because my God, do we need it.
Absolutely.
And I hope it will be useful too, and I shall send you a copy.
Fantastic.
I've lived in many different countries, Java and Borneo being two of them, and I helped Chris get into Cyprus.
Okay.
Two of us here were invited to Halki, which was the Ecumenical Patriarch's latest collection, or a latest summit, to try to get education on this into the seminaries. I've been pushing it for 6 years since I started, and I know Elizabeth has been doing this, and others here. But still, within the church, all the churches, not one, as far as we know, has the seminaries, has an ecological module in the seminaries. I've written a basic outline. So if anyone here has that, and if your institution has something that we could use, because we're looking for this, and we need it, because whilst we get wonderful proclamations from the patriarchs and the popes, most people only hear this through their local priest, and the priests are not things. So what could you offer?
Well, I think things are changing very fast at the moment, and in an encouraging direction. So I'm an Anglican, ordained Anglican, and within the Anglican Church, several of the colleges are now teaching modules on this. In most of them, it's still optional rather than foundational, and that needs to change. The only way it's going to become foundational, and we're in discussions on this, is when they rewrite the criteria for formation for all the clergy. And if it's required that all clergy have to have a foundation in ecological theology, then the colleges will have to teach it. So that's the way we're trying to work at that at the moment, and there's real progress being made. The Roman Catholic Church, as you'll know, since Laudato Si, the papal encyclical, there's been a huge change, and there's now a Laudato Si Institute just starting in Oxford, and I think we're going to find that this is fast track into the training of Catholic priests quite quickly. And around the world, I'm finding that almost a week, hardly a week goes by without requests from a college, a seminary somewhere saying, we need to teach this, have you got resources we can use? So we've been producing some, and we want to produce more, and I'll happily talk with you afterwards about more. So it's happening, but it's rather late in the day. Yeah.
Thank you. Got a point just there.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I find it fascinating, and I just want to ask you about the early Christian view that you engage with as anthropocentrism. So I want to ask, so as far as I understand, the early Christians, especially the patristic authors, found the focus, the singling out of the human as the focus that's actually required from the reading of Scripture in order to restore a right relationship with creation. So I'm thinking of the whole tradition following from Origen, but consummating in Maximus the Confessor. The idea is that only if the human, seeing his or her relation to be restored to God, with God, and to fellow human beings, to become right again, there is a restoration with creation and the rest of nature be possible. And I just want to comment on that, because I think I sense, I'm not sure whether that's a conflict, but the way I read the patristic tradition suggests that anthropocentrism is not necessarily in conflict with what you call whatever centrism.
Thank you.
That's my...
Yeah, no, it's a really important question, and in a sense you've pointed out a weakness in my presentation. Inevitably, you have to simplify for a presentation like this from a sort of 80,000 word thesis. And what I talk about in the thesis is the fact that the early church fathers were profoundly theocentric. They believed it was all for God, but I divide up theocentrism into kind of theo-anthropocentrism and theo-ecocentrism. And the early church fathers were theo-anthropocentric, in they believed God had made the world in a way in which human beings were absolutely critical. It was God's world, but we were critical to how it functioned. We were given a position of great power and responsibility within the world. So that's very much the view that Origen was saying there. What I think is problematic in that is that it did borrow not only from Scripture, but quite profoundly from Greek philosophy, and that it tended to assume that God's sole purpose in making the world was focused around human beings. And there are, as I suggested, a number of biblical passages and themes which point otherwise, that the earth was made for God's pleasure and God's glory. In terms of Colossians, all things were made by and for Christ, not for us. And that, I think, somehow got lost in a lot of that early church theology, and that's what we need to rediscover. And what I suggest in the thesis is a kind of theo-ecocentrism. So it's very much God's world, but we need an ecological understanding of how the world works, where we're part of it, and we have a particular and important function, but it's not all about us. So it's a nuanced view, more so than I was able to present in this. But thank you.
Come across, just the lady here, and then forward one.
Thank you very much. I had my hand up before, but I was very interested by the comment at the back and your answer, because I'm not convinced that this has fallen out in the Church Fathers nearly as much as is often assumed. Sure. It's fallen out rather more in Western Church Fathers than in Eastern.
Absolutely.
But this relates, I mean, whether Western or Eastern, this relates very much to the original point that I wanted to make, that you've been talking throughout about man and nature, and of course in the wider discussion, the secular discussion, one may have to use those terms, but it seems to me that it's really crucial that in Christian terms the division is creator and creation. And once you think in those terms, one can argue about, is man part of nature, but there's no dispute that man, and I mean anthropos, is part of creation.
Absolutely.
And this is the independent whole. So it becomes self-evident that we're all in it together. And it also seems to me that with something like ecosystem services, which on one level is obviously has some truth in it, if one sees this as part of mutual service, then it can cease to be exploitative. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think I wouldn't disagree with anything that you've said there. And I think, yes, a mutual understanding, a much more mutual understanding of something like ecosystem services would be really helpful, rather than simply seeing it as serving us. So, yeah, I don't want to add to what you've said. I would agree with you.
Hi, thanks for that. I just sort of wanted to ask, kind of in a practical way as well as theological, how do we balance living out that first mandate to work the earth and care for it from sort of Gen 215 onwards, and the new commission we've got to go and make disciples of all nations, and in terms of how do we hold both of those today? Is that different to when it was first given?
I think it is different because we live in the New Testament times now, but to me those two are wonderfully compatible, and I guess this is where, having been part of a Rocha which in over 35 years has been trying to do this in practical ways in now more than 20 countries around the world, what we see, and I'm quoting here an evangelist who I worked with quite closely some years ago, when Christians take the earth seriously, people take the gospel seriously, is what he said. And what we find is that actually if we have this, it's not an either or. It's not that we're caring for the planet or we're caring for people. It's not that we're saving seals or saving souls. It's a case of we are aiming to live out the good news of Jesus Christ in its fullness and to share that good news in its fullness. And that means caring for the poor, it means caring for the planet, it means preaching the gospel of redemption and reconciliation. And that integrated, holistic view is so much more attractive. And as churches begin to grasp that and present that, I think, particularly amongst the many, many young people today who are full of spiritual hunger, but are pretty turned off by what they've seen of Christianity, I believe that's far more attractive.
I'll take one more question, and Brian, I think, there had his hands up.
Thank you very much. Very, very helpful. And I wonder if I could just pick up a word you used towards the end about restoration, because so many of us now know so much about the impact issues that you talked about at the beginning. And then, of course, we start to move to the idea of creation care from a Christian perspective. But I'm impressed by David King's concern about climate change and the establishment of a centre here in Cambridge for climate change repair.
Yeah.
And I wonder whether we really ought to be talking now as Christians much more about repair, because we know the globe is broken.
Yes.
We've broken the planet.
Yes.
So why don't we now start to emphasize repair as something that is for the future? This is the new future that we're looking towards.
I think that's very helpful language. Restoration, I was partly just getting carried away with all my R's when I was talking about how kainos can be defined. But of course, ecological restoration is a whole scientific discipline. I've got a friend who's got a master's in restoration ecology. But what that basically is repair. Restoration ecology. It's saying, here's a piece of land that we have polluted either with pesticides and herbicides and inappropriate fertilizers, or here's a piece of land, that former industrial land. Let's see if we can repair it so that nature can thrive once again in that place. And I guess what we're talking about is on a much bigger and global scale in the light of climate change. Repair is an ambitious term. It may be a case of mitigation as much as repair, because the projections in terms of climate change are that whatever we do, things are going to get a lot worse. But we can repair some of the mess we've made. I guess the restoration is almost a more theological vision of what God will finally do. And what we do now, we have to see in the light of that. And one of the dangers of using language of restoration and repair for us now is that it can lead to a we're going to save the planet kind of mentality. And we're not on our own, because we show no evidence that we're very good at it. So I believe theologically in restoration. I believe that we should be anticipating that through our mitigation and adaptation and repair around climate change and biodiversity loss. But are we going to save the planet on our own? I'm not optimistic that we are. But will God? Yes.